Today we are going to discuss in this afternoon panel about institutional models of participatory democratic innovation from different perspectives. I'm happy to have here the group of people and very interesting, most of them coming from Serbia with one exception, which I'm start with actually. Nina Desmet, if I'm pronouncing it well, yes, from University of Ghent. She's going to talk us a little bit more on the impact of participatory design on local councillors' attitudes. A very interesting topic, especially from the perspective that we have some now. It's a few people from here who became local councillor in the city of Belgrade, so it will be really interesting to see and hear the perspective from Belgium. We are going to have then Mladen Ostojic, who is going to speak us a little bit more on Yugoslav self-management, an example of participatory urban governance, and this is a topic which is very relevant for our institute because this revival, or let's say bringing back to the public sphere what we lived through socialism and learning from it is something which we find as really, really important. Ivana Damjanovic from Faculty of Political Sciences joining us, speaking on the same topic from different perspectives, so more general than Mladen will tell us. Then we are having Jovana Timotijević and Iva Čukić from Ministry of Space or Institute for Urban Politics, I don't know, dear friends, that are going to tell us a little bit more on participatory forums as the enactment of the right to the city, building a model for institutional democratization of urban planning, and they are working a lot in this field. I think when somebody mentioned urban planning, the primary association I have is the Ministry of Space and two of them. So this is something which we, there are also our people taking part in this designing process, so I'm really interested to hear more. And last but not the least, as they say, Andrija Šoć, the colleague from Faculty of Philosophy of University of Belgrade, who is going to speak more about participation, responsiveness, interaction, or benefits of epistemic checks and balances for revitalization of democratic institutions, which is also the topic which is really important for the Institute, and we even had about epistemic quality of democracy, we had a whole conference here in September last year, so this is a continuation of the working on this topic. So without further ado, I would let first Nina to present, and then we are going to continue in this order. Oh, yes, yes. Pointer. Here. Can you open just the...
Okay, good afternoon everybody. So I am Nina from Ghent University. I'm from a totally different, sorry. Okay, from a totally different context than Serbia. I am actually researching Flanders. It's just a region in Belgium. And as she said, it's like I'm researching the impact of participatory design on councillors. And for this paper, I investigated their attitudes concerning these participatory designs. It's actually a paper in a giant project, in an interdisciplinary project in Belgium, where also psychologists and civil servants are actually included. Oh, I can hear myself. So we are actually researching and citizens and politicians and civil society as a whole. So to introduce the local Flemish context, we have a lot of experiments with these participatory democracy. We can see on the top of the presentation, like the citizen panel in Ghent, where I'm actually working at. And they were discussing about a mobility plan to get the better cycling and walking, but also, of course, for cars, better roads. Then we also have experiments like participatory budgeting. That's the next photo. This one is from Termont. It's not so known, but it's close to my living place. And on the bottom, you can see an example of an online referendum outcome where, as you can see, there was a non-decision on the question. But the answer is, what is the effect of these experiments actually on our local councillors? So I define actually participation as the extended role of citizens in policymaking beyond voting in elections, so more than just casting a vote in a ballot box. And of course, I'm not researching the citizens, but I'm researching the councillors, so I'm researching the more political role and the legislative role, and they can take on different roles in these participatory arrangements. If you compare it to the puzzle, you can see like a councillor who takes one puzzle piece and he can actually put the puzzle piece at the right place and facilitate participatory arrangements and make it happen. But he can also like hide a puzzle piece in order to resist, to not make it work. And the last role that a councillor can take on is a meter governor role. And then you can see like a councillor who doesn't take a puzzle piece itself, but he looks at the whole process and he looks at, yeah, everybody gets included, everybody gets to put their puzzle pieces in and gets their voice heard. That is the media governor role. So as stated in the previous panel, their politicians' attitudes are mainly driven by instrumental motivations because, of course, councillors, they have these strategic interests in order to compete in elections, to win visibility. So that is the driver of their attitudes to participatory arrangements. The contribution of this paper is multiple because earlier research mainly focused on legitimacy in general and on their general perceptions of participatory arrangements, but not on specific types of legitimacy, like the subdimensions, input, throughput, and output legitimacy of these participatory processes. And it's mostly focused on one specific type of arrangement, like participatory budgeting, deliberative democracy, citizen panels, and all this. Of course, there are benefits for councillors. These are the instrumental motivations that they can use to be positive about participatory arrangements. It is seen as producing more reasoned, more discussion, more innovative policy decisions, but is also seen as a process that gives some fairness to the decision making, and therefore citizens are believed to accept the decisions from these participatory arrangements more. Of course, it's not only benefits, it's not only rainbow and sunshine, it is also sometimes a problem. Councillors, of course, are elected via this direct representative logic, but these participatory arrangements actually get them away from that logic. They get a different role, they get a totally different perspective, and actually their final decision-making role is weakened, is decreased. As you can see, as you see, like, power is a zero-sum game, so you can have councillors with a lot of power, and you can have like citizens with less power. But with participatory introduction, it's actually like coming more of a different balance, because the power of councillors is actually decreasing, and the power of citizens is increasing. But that can, of course, give conflicting roles with councillors who like to decide on themselves, who like to be autonomous, who like to be like the power-making councillors. So actually, citizens gain power to the expense of these citizens in participatory arrangements. For this paper, we used a very complex vignette survey, where we have two independent variables, namely the initiator of the arrangement. So we can have like top-down government-initiated arrangements, and we can have bottom-up citizens arrangements. We put it in the survey as a between subject design, so all respondents get either all top-down arrangements or either all bottom-up arrangements. The second independent variable was the citizens' impact of participatory arrangements, where we have 4 different levels actually of citizens' impact. The classic representative democracy, where citizens have some say but really low. Then consultative arrangements where citizens can give advice, can be consulted in order to make policy. The co-decisive forms of participatory arrangements where citizens and government actually come together and make decisions together. And the decisive is the most far-reaching form of participation where citizens actually become the decision makers themselves. From these vignettes, we actually have 2 research questions. The one is, what is the impact of the initiator? And the second is, what is the impact of the citizens' power in these participatory arrangements? Of course, it is focused on the impact on attitudes of local councillors. To make it more tangible, so the first arrangement that our respondents got was the classic. Everybody got the classic representative democracy condition. And then they were put in one of the 2 boxes. Either they got all top-down arrangements, but they got it in a random order, so it's not like everybody gets consultative at scene first and co-decisive, but they get it in a random order in order to not get some problems with our vignette design. To make it more clear, these are the real questions or the real texts that the respondents got on the decision-making process. So the baseline condition, classic representative democracy, was about the repurposing of school building. So the decision had to be made of the function that this old school building that was vacant had to be had to get, which functions, which way does it have to go, and these forms of participation were given to them as a possible decision-making form. So how do we measure these attitudes of councillors? We have, as I said, the 3 dimensions of legitimacy, the input, throughput, and output. Input is focused on what can citizens contribute, which views are taken into account, what what groups of society can put their inputs into these participatory arrangements. Throughput is about, is it a fair way? Is the procedure is it a good way of deciding? And is it transparent actually? Can everybody see what's happening, how it's made, the decision? And output is about efficiency, effectiveness. After these 3 legitimacy dimensions, we also asked them what they found generally, what they think about the decision-making process of the old school building. I drew 2 hypotheses on these independent variables. For the first, as I stated, there are some drawbacks for councillors to participatory arrangements. Since their final decision-making role is weakened, councillors are believed to remain cautious and they try to stay in control. Therefore, it is hypothesized that top-down arrangement actually would be believed to be more legitimate than the bottom-up arrangement. For the second independent variable, we think that co-decision and decision forms of decision-making on the school building is actually challenging to the power of councillors, and therefore is actually going to be perceived as less legitimate than the classic decision-making or the consultative decision-making forms. We investigated the population in Flanders, and in Flanders we have 5,500 local councillors, and since our municipalities are sometimes bigger and sometimes smaller, it depends on the inhabitants of the municipality on how many councillors are in each municipality, but we sent out the survey to every councillor in every municipality in Flanders. Eventually, 1,200 councillors also participated, but since the data was still being collected while writing this paper, I had to analyze a first sample and preliminary results on 765 councillors, where like no majors and aldermen are included, because I focus on the legislative branch of the council. These councillors all finished their questionnaires and seem to be representative of the whole population of councillors in terms of gender and party. So the most interesting part, what are the results of these survey? So I'm going to first give a state of the overall evaluations. As I said, we asked our councillors what do they generally think about the different process of decision making. And as we can see for the first hypothesis on the initiator of the arrangement, we have a significant main effect of this type of initiator, which means that it is true that the councillors estimate the government on top-down initiatives as better with a mean score of 5.69 than the bottom-up arrangement with a mean score of 5.44, which is of course a little difference, and the effect was also very small, but it is a significant difference. The second hypothesis was based on the citizens' impact. We see that it was partly accepted, because we can see the red bar in the middle is actually for either government or citizen-initiated arrangements perceived as the best way of decision-making with the school building, and not the consultative green bar that we expected to be the highest. So actually, we can state that there's like a tipping point where councillors perceive that co-decision is the best way of deciding on the school building repurposing. We did some additional analysis. This is a cluster analysis because as we saw this overall trend in the previous slide, we know that councillors, of course, differ from each other. They are not always thinking the same about now I'm there. They are not all thinking the same. So we have like 4 different groups in this cluster analysis. And as you can see, there's a big difference between the red and the blue and the green and the red underneath. I named them just intuitively. They are not fine-grained conceptions about councillors' perceptions, but it's just easier to like state what they think about participation. The first group is a traditionalist group, is the blue line, where classic representation and consultation is like seen as pretty good. But as you can see, when citizens' impact increases, the estimates about their attitudes are actually pretty much lower. Then we have like the participatory advocates, as I call them, but you can like call them differently. They perceive classic and consultative decision-making as rather bad, rather poor, but they perceive co-decision as the best way and decision forms as the least best way. Then I have a third cluster of indifference, which can also be called over-enthusiast, because they are like putting 8 to 11 score on every single way of decision making. And the last group of councillors is a group of what I call mainstreamers, because they actually follow the overall trend from the previous slide in participatory arrangements. The last additional analysis was on the legitimacy dimensions, so the statements that I already mentioned. We see that there is an interaction effect of power and the dimensions of legitimacy. I'm going to focus on the classic forms of decision-making, where we can see that councillors perceive the input legitimacy as way poorer than their output legitimacy. This means that councillors actually don't like the inputs that citizens give in these classic forms of decision-making, but they are more positive about their output legitimacy. Then the next I'm going to focus on is the decision forms of decision-making, where like councillors perceive that the output is rather low, is in comparison to their input legitimacy. So we can state that councillors actually perceive the effectiveness, efficiency, that was the word, as better than, as worse than the input legitimacy of citizens. To conclude and to make the puzzle together, we can state that councillors actually do assess top-down arrangements better than bottom-up arrangements, although it's a small difference, and it's only on the case of repurposing of the school building. Then secondly, we see that co-decision is like a tipping point where they believe that it's the best way of making this decision, while classic representative democracy is actually not something they desire in this case of the repurposing of the school building. From these two conclusions, we can actually state that councillors do assess their attitudes and their evaluation of participatory arrangements on their interests for the participatory arrangement and decision. The last conclusion is that, of course, the input legitimacy and output legitimacy is distinctly evaluated by councillors. As we saw, some arrangements are rather perceived as bad at input legitimacy, while better at output legitimacy. I have one last remark to make. So we did this survey now, but since I started last year, at the end of last year, it is only a start of the project, and for the next years, I'm actually going to be working more qualitative and more dig deeper into what this means, in general, with councillors. So, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. I have actually read Mladen's paper, and he has a very focused case study. Unlike him, I don't have nothing resembling that. What I do have is some preliminary thoughts and kind of an outline of something that seems to be shaping into some kind of long-term pet project of mine. But the basic idea behind it is that socialist self-government in Yugoslavia can and should be studied from the framework of democratic innovations on several different levels for several different reasons. And I said this will be very theoretical. My presentation is mostly some concepts and some pictures. And I will try to explain why I think that this is really important to not forget what we did, what we had actually, because democratic innovations, especially in practice in Serbia, as my previous research has shown, are mostly externally driven, connected to specific projects, usually financed by external donors, international organizations, and so forth. So on. And they are introduced in terms of, let's show you how it's done. So my idea is maybe we should see how we actually did that, and maybe that would be more sustainable than what we have now. But we'll come to that. So my first issue is the issue of terminology. So if you look at the literature in English about this period, you can sometimes find self-management, sometimes find self-government. It's hard to decide what to use. But I don't think that it is a coincidence that we have two different translations, and I think that that argument can be made that they are used in different contexts and to denote different things. Why? Because what you see here is, of course, Marx's idea of the structure of society. Because the socialist self-government had two very distinct components, and they're both crucial for the theoretical justification of the project. And I have to admit that when I started to read on this topic, I was actually surprised how sound the arguments are for introduction of the new system. How sound, how logical, with one, of course, caveat is that when you start from the framework of dialectical materialism, which they were starting from. Why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because they say Edward Kadel, who was the major force, the major person, thinker and practitioner behind this whole project, he explicitly says something like this. Individual ownership over the means of the production is the root of alienation, is the foundation of inequality. And if you just transfer the ownership over the means of the production to the state as a monopolist, as was the case in Soviet Union, in other socialist states who were part of the Eastern Bloc, then you still have the same problem, just with another actor. So we have to abolish this type of ownership. And they then invented a new type of ownership over the means of the production, which they call social or public ownership. Also, the translations differ in English. That's one of the major problems when trying to think and write about these issues in English. They say this will provide a model of production, economic basis, which will then produce, and we will, with help from the state, superstructure, which is also based on participatory democracy and workers' rights. The other very important thing is that he and the others are repeatedly emphasizing democracy as one of their goals in order to create a society of truly equal people, workers, citizens. They really use the word democracy a lot. So, lots of things can be said about the theoretical conceptualization of this project, lots can be said about sincerity and, of course, implementation, but what they were saying was we are aiming for true democracy. True democracy is only possible if we abolish individual ownership over the means of the production. And so, there are actually two maybe equally important, maybe not that equally important branches. One is the change of the economic system, and I think there, with a focus on workplace democracy, and there I think the worker self-management is the right translation. That's the part where we should use self-management. Of course, this is the part of the project which actually gained most of the international scholarly attention. Less perceived, perhaps, from the Western scholars were the changes in political system, which consisted in introduction of delegate system. We heard, I think, on the previous panel how it is conceived to work from bottom up, which involved some participatory mechanism, and there I think we should use the term social self-government, because it's not really management, it's the form of self-governing. What is also very interesting, or was very interesting for me when I started reading about this, that this is just, okay, where am I? I forgot to show you the Marxist structure of society, but you know how it is. And also, this is what I just said, I'm sorry. This is one illustration from 1980 about its edited volume about workplace democracy, and this is actually an entry in the contents of this edited volume, and as you can read, it says, "For now, it seems to work." It did not work for very long after that, I must admit. But this was really a major innovation in itself, And lots of very serious scholars of democracy, starting with Robert Dahl, with Carol Pateman, and many, many, many others, actually wrote about it. Not necessarily framed as democratic innovations because the field was not invented yet, but in terms of some sort of expansion of democratic practices and principles away from representative democracy, away from political sphere. This is, as I'm sure you know, one of the major maybe debates or maybe issues, questions in democracy, democratic theory. Is democracy possible outside the political sphere? So can we have democracy in the sphere of economy, in the workplace, and in other spheres of society? For some people, this was kind of ray of hope that it may be possible. There were very frequent comparisons between this and Mondragon cooperatives in Spain and so on and so forth. So, what's another interesting issue here is that both Edward Cardell and Josip Broz Tito, they insisted that what they are doing, their reforms, this new social and political system, are very new. Cardell at one point calls it revolutionary. But they are also trying to somehow connect it with tradition and with one consistent ideological narrative. So if you read, and I must say, reading is quite hard, I think Mladen will confirm, because the language and the style is very bureaucratic, and there are very long rhetorical formulations which repeat throughout the text. But if you read, for example, Josip Broz Tito's exposition for the 10th Congress of the Communist League, he explicitly links this social self-government with the works of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, with the practices of Paris Commune. On the other hand, Cardell is explicitly linking this to the traditions of the Second World War anti-fascist struggle, to the practices on freed territories, and they say, so the working people are actually just, you know, keep doing what they were used to do. I could argue that this could go from another, of course, completely another philosophical and theoretical tradition. Maybe it can intersect with in the writings of Svetozar Marković. There is also a strong tradition, especially in rural communities in Serbia, of some sort of self-government. So that's another tradition, but it was not what they wanted to put in the front, so they insisted that this is a part of this socialist narrative. Let me see where I am. If we go one level down, I say these are case studies. These are not really case studies. These are areas that we should look into, and perhaps Mladen did a case study. Perhaps we should do many more. But two areas that I think that we should look into are the local communities, or mesne zajednice, as form not of self-government, but as Mladen says, embodiments of local community. And the other is, I translated it as self-contribution, Mladen translated it as a voluntary contribution, and I think his translation is better, which is kind of voluntary tax. Why I think these two institutions are important. First, they still are exist in Serbian laws now. Not with the same authority, not with the same scope and so on, but they do exist. Mesne zajednice, local communities, has a very, very wide scope of their activities, and there is a huge amount of literature about it, about local communities and from local communities, if you look at self-contribution or voluntary contribution also. It's still defined, it is possible, you can find the conditions how to do and the instructions how to do it in the law on the financing of local self-government. But since the beginning of the 90s, there is practically no literature on this topic, on voluntary contribution. It is used, sometimes it is mentioned in the media, but not systematically. There are maybe three, I think I found three, not necessarily academic, but professional type of papers written on this topic. And why I think that these two institutions could solve some of the problems that we were talking about yesterday and today, and which I found in line with my previous research about democratic innovations in Serbia. So when I did that like review of democratic innovations in Serbia, it was, I think, 5 or 6 years ago, my main conclusions were that they are distinctly lacking the deliberative component, and as we saw, the colleagues from our host institution are working hard on remedying that aspect. But the other thing is that they were externally driven and therefore unsustainable. So if you can have participatory budgeting, and it was done and it was written about, but it is always tied to some kind of project, either as a focus of the project, either as a part of the project. So you have local communities who say, okay, we need money because we want to paint like this building, and the donor said, fine, but you have to do participatory budgeting if you want the money. And so they do it, but when the funds are like dry out, and they say, this is a great idea, we really need it, but we're never going to do it again because we have no money, we have no resources, and so on and so on. Unlike that, the other problem with participatory budgeting in Serbia is that the local the municipalities actually have very small percentage of their overall budget available for any kind of public debate, because most of the funds that they get are tied up for, they have to use it for some legally binding things like paying different sorts of civil servants and so on and so forth. And so the funds are very small, which are available for participatory budgeting. Unlike that, voluntary contribution is some kind of voluntary tax. So people can not only decide what they need, they can decide how much that costs, and they can decide how much of their own income are they willing to dedicate to that purpose. So it can be legally done. And in my opinion, perhaps in the better road for people who are trying to introduce democratic innovations in practice would be not necessarily to rely solely on donor-driven initiatives, but to try to revitalize and to strengthen these institutions that we actually do have. We just forgot how we can use them. And I will, my last slide, I think it's last, no? Okay, my last slide is this very poetic quote for Edward Kadel about what self-management is, and I will finish with that. Thank you very much.
Let's hear now a little bit more about the sort of before you start, it's really interesting because you said a lot about the self-management of the workers' communities, whatever you want to do in English. And it's interesting, 2 days ago I read on Twitter there is sort of very information that Helen Landemore is working actually on economic democracy, where they are meaning exactly this, what we already in some form have. And I don't know how much we are successful or how much we are trying to actually say that there is something which was already there in place and what were the good sides. I think it's really useful for not only for us, and if we want to go back there, some yes, some obviously not. But in general, I think as a source, no, I just turned it off. I forgot, sorry. As a source of information for others, I think this is really interesting.
Yes, and I will look into Helen. I looked at her work for some other topics, but I didn't know that she's working
something
on it.
New, yeah.
But we should communicate this. Maybe even if we could try to communicate this to donor organizations, like we don't have to do this, we can do this instead.
Yes.
I'm not sure if that would work, but
they also have ticking boxes like municipalities. Yes, I know. Thank you. Mladen.
Okay, thank you, Ivana. It was great to have such a great introduction. Is that okay? Yeah? I'm too loud. Okay.
No, close to the mic.
Ah, closer, like this?
No, it's okay.
No? Okay, but I need to, to look at this in that direction. So yeah, it was great to have such a good introduction, and it was great also to hear Roger's thinking about wards and town hall meetings and the ideas of citizen assemblies in the United States. Because I'm going to talk about how similar ideas were introduced in Yugoslavia during socialism. So I'm going to talk more in detail about mesne zajednice, which are translated literally in English as local communities, even if this doesn't do justice to the mesne zajednice, which are not like organic local communities, but an institution that was set up to promote citizen participation in decision-making over local matters. So just a few words about the background of my research. Basically, I developed an interest on this topic with the emergence of municipalism, which we can define as a doctrine that stands for the reappropriation of politics by citizens through the development of self-governing institutions based on the model of the commons. And I think the attempt to implement municipalism in Spain has raised several serious questions about how we can put into practice these ideas of moving away from representative democracy and moving beyond participatory democracy towards turning really municipal institutions and public services into commons. I think that we can learn a lot about this based on the experience of socialist Yugoslavia. As Ivana said earlier on, most of the literature in English on self-management in Yugoslavia deals with workers' self-management within the social enterprises. There's very little about municipal or urban governance. I came across only 2 articles on these topics that date back to the 70s. At the same time, the literature in Serbo-Croatian doesn't give a good insight into how the local communities worked in practice, because most of this literature has a normative dimension which seeks to basically give some insights on how these institutions should be improved or developed, meaning that they expect the readers to already have this knowledge. So this is why I decided to really do research on how the local communities worked by focusing on Belgrade in the 1980s. So before going into the local communities, we need to understand how the process of decentralization was designed and implemented in Yugoslavia. Edward Kardelj, who was the main ideologist of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia, stated that the main objective of socialist self-management was to establish such productive relations through which the working man gets the possibility of direct management and decisive influence on the means and conditions of production and the fruits of his labor, from economic policy in the enterprise to the social plan. So this was implemented through social ownership over the means of production, which Ivana talked about, but also through the process of socialization of the state, which involved the transfer of state functions to self-managed communities. And this transfer was mostly implemented at the level of the commune, which was considered as the basic socio-economic unit of society and the basis of direct socialist democracy. So the process of decentralization was implemented in 2 directions. Vertically, by transferring power and competencies from the republican and federal levels to the level of the communes, and horizontally within the commune by transferring power from the institution, the communal institution, to self-managed communities. Now, the local communities were the most important type of self-managed community within the commune. They were established at the neighborhood level in urban areas, and they encompassed 1 or several villages in rural areas. Now, they had 3 main objectives. The first was to allow citizens to take part in decision-making over local matters such as urban planning, housing, public utilities, child welfare and social protection, education, culture, sports, consumer protection, and the environment. The second is that they provided some public services to the residents, such as assistance to families and households, social assistance to vulnerable groups, and dispute resolution mechanisms. And the third, and perhaps one of the most important role of the local community, was to provide some space for social interaction for the citizens. Now, the local communities were supposed to promote welfare and the development of human socialist relations by providing this space. So in the local communities, people gathered to socialize, to watch TV, to play chess or other board games, and some local communities were turned into nightclubs for the youth. So it's important to understand that the local communities were not an extension of local governments, and they were not either supposed to be a counterweight to the local or Republican government, but rather an embodiment of the local community. So how did local communities work? Well, they had an assembly which played a central role in decision making. The assembly was composed of delegates, half of which were elected by the citizens directly through citizens' assemblies, and the other half were elected by workers within enterprises and social political organizations located in the local community. The assembly elected a president, an executive council, and a secretary as executive bodies, whereas the citizens also elected the delegates who represented the local community within the municipal assembly. At that time, the municipal assembly was divided in 3 chambers, one of which was the Chamber of Local Communities, where delegates from local communities were sitting. Now, it's important also to emphasize here that the local community was not meant to work as a forum. Instead of that, several commissions and councils were established around the assembly, which had the power to negotiate and to strike deals with enterprises and social political organizations in the area. So, for example, every local community had a council for consumer protection, which monitored and reported on the prices of consumer goods in the area. The local communities also had dispute resolution councils, which were outsourced bodies of the local tribunal, and which were meant to resolve like small disputes among citizens. So the citizens had the opportunity to participate in direct decision-making over the most important decisions in the citizens' assemblies, which were held every 2nd or 3rd months. They also had the possibility to take part in referendums, which were organized mostly in relation to the voluntary contributions about which Ivana was talking. So the voluntary contributions were the most important source of funding of local communities. This was a self-imposed tax that local residents voted to introduce in their area to fund some capital investments. Besides that, the local communities also received some money from the communal budget, which mostly co-financed the voluntary contributions and also provided funding for, covered the running cost of the local communities. They also received contributions from the local enterprises where workers set money aside for public investment in their areas. And finally, some local communities were able to generate some additional revenues through renting space, especially in Belgrade. Now, the local communities have had relatively low running costs because most of the people involved in their running were volunteers, apart from the secretary, the administrative secretary, and the courier. So it's important to ask who were these people who were putting time on site for this purpose, and how could the local communities be functional if they relied entirely on volunteers? Well, the Socialist Alliance of Working People played a key role in the smooth running of local communities by recruiting, training, and rewarding activists for their work in the local communities. The Socialist Alliance was the biggest socio-political organization, which included basically all the legal organizations in the country, from the League of Communists of Yugoslavia to trade unions, youth organizations, charities such as the Red Cross, or even religious organizations. In spite of the fact that Yugoslavia was a single-party state, it had quite an important civil society. Now, the 74 Constitution provided that candidates for local community delegates be put forward by working people in the Socialist Alliance, and that the selection process be conducted by the Socialist Alliance. This means that all the delegates in the local communities were screened by the Socialist Alliance, within which the League of Communists played a key role. Now, in practice, this allowed the League of Communists to exert influence at the lowest level of organization of society and to get the feedback from the field about the expectations and the needs of citizens. They also used the local communities as a lever for recruiting and selecting activists, because the delegates in the local communities had limited mandates. They could only have 2 mandates in a row. This was a good testing ground for future political activists at a higher level, whether at the municipal, communal, or Republican level. Now, obviously, this influenced very much the level of representation of different parts of this population in the local communities. The activists were, for the most part, individuals with political ambitions and pensioners who had enough free time to dedicate to social engagement. Now here, there was a big difference between local communities in rural areas and in urban areas, because in the rural areas, people had very concrete needs that they had to address through the local communities. So they were much more motivated to take part, and there was much more self-organizing in the rural areas. Whereas in the urban areas, often the local communities were staffed with retired army officers, retired public officials, and people who were kind of embedded in the local power structures. So this raises the question of how much influence the local communities had, and to what extent could citizens really take part in decision-making through them. Well, there were 3 ways in which local communities influenced policy making. First of all, as I said earlier, each local community had delegates in the municipal assembly, and these delegates could raise issues, problems, and expectations of the local population and put them on the agenda of the municipal authorities. Secondly, the communes had the obligation to take into account the annual and medium-term plans of local communities when drafting communal plans, and to make funds available to local communities to implement these plans. This means that citizens had the possibility to participate in social planning at the level of the commune, or even at a higher level through their local communities. And finally, the communes could not make any important decisions without consulting local communities. This opinion was not binding, but it was respected, especially when the local communities was headed by influential people, which was often the case in the cities, and especially in Belgrade. Now, in urban areas, local communities also played a consultative role for some decisions made at the level of the city administration, and this was the focus of my case study, which looks at the voluntary contribution that was introduced by the authorities in Belgrade in 1982. Now, in the early 80s, Belgrade found itself in a very difficult economic and financial situation, as did the whole country. There were not enough funds for the essential capital investments to keep the city going. So this was the first time, and the only time so far, that the authorities decided to introduce a voluntary contribution. Now, my research focused on the process of preparing for this voluntary contribution, and it had several stages. First of all, the members of the Executive Council held close consultations with representatives of urban municipalities, the Socialist Alliance and trade unions, as well as with experts from various fields. Here I mention urban municipalities because the city of Belgrade is divided in today 17, and at the time it was 15 urban municipalities, but only 10 of them were involved, encompassed by the voluntary contribution. So through this closed consultation, they set the higher limit of the voluntary contribution to 2% of net personal income. This means that every citizen in Belgrade would have to pay 2% of its net income for the voluntary contribution for 4 years, which at the end amounted, I think, to 1 monthly salary. Of course, some straight of the population were excluded from this. They also defined 3 priority areas. The first was the improvement and development of the water supply. The second was the development of public transport. And the third was the building of a polyclinic within the clinical center. Now, since every voluntary contribution had to be voted in a referendum, the authorities had to gain the support of the population for this. So they organized public hearings in the local communities around Belgrade for 2 months. And at these hearings, citizens were able to give their views, their opinions, but also to propose changes to the existing projects. Now, most of these consultations and these discussions were about the public transport, which way the new tram lines and trolleybus lines should go, which streets should be reconstructed, and so on. But they also allowed citizens to contribute to defining how these projects would be implemented and how they will be monitored. The voluntary contribution was voted in a referendum in May 1982, which is exactly 40 years ago, in local communities and social enterprises. And it was implemented relatively successfully over the next 4 years, although there was a lot of criticism on the part of citizens for the solutions chosen for public transport. There was a lot of criticism about the fact that the money was spent on expanding the tram system and the trolleybus system instead of starting to build the metro, which Belgrade badly needed and still needs nowadays. So I think this tells us a bit about the extent of the influence of local communities at the time. What happened was that citizens were given the opportunity to give their views and to propose changes to projects that were predefined, pre-designed by the city authorities. But they didn't have the possibility to propose themselves projects or to influence strategic decisions such as whether the public transport would involve new tram lines or a metro. And I think that on the basis of this, we can argue or suggest that the local communities allowed for participatory decision making, but that they fell short of allowing for direct solutions as proclaimed by the leadership of the feminist party. Thank you. Thank you.
Now we are going ahead with the presentations here. Jan and Eva. Thank you, Barbara. We are overloaded with work and from all around the world, so we didn't manage to make a presentation. I'm sorry, but we can make one and then share it afterwards. So thank you for having us. We will shortly present the case studies, the cases of pre-participatory forums that we run in Belgrade. We were inspired by the work of Erasmus philosophy and social theory and the mini-public that they had in November 2020, right? And also I want to use this opportunity to thank you for the support you gave us in these studies, especially to Irena Piket, our master guru in designing the methodology for participatory forums that we wanted to introduce with the idea to improve the planning system in Serbia. So we are coming from the Collective Ministry of Space that is kind of trying to develop some innovative models in the urban planning field, and working a lot with the local communities and grassroots groups on the territory of Belgrade, but also outside of this city. So in Serbia, even though participation mechanisms in the process of adopting the planning documents are foreseen by the legislatory framework, the formal procedures demonstrate the significant lack of democratic capacity, and are often performed at the level or even below the prescribed minimum. We will later also show some data on the monitoring of the participation process that we did a few months ago. As a result, there is also a growing number of spatial conflicts and injustices that are constituting the urban life in our cities. And there is kind of the current practice shows that we need a radical transformation in this field. So drawing from the approach of collaborative planning that applies deliberative democracy in the area of planning, our collective has been exploring the model of these deliberative mini-publics in 3 urban plans adoption situation in Belgrade, in different phases with different communities. And we will present shortly the results of these forums and also how they were designed. But before the presentation of the concrete forums, I will just give a short overview of the context of urban planning in Serbia and also how participation functions. We can get into more details later if you would like to discuss that more. So the collapse of the socialist system and the transition, they led to so-called democratic deficit syndrome in the planning practice. And it was further emphasized by inadequate institutional and organizational arrangements in the spatial development. Especially after 2000s, we can also refer to the period before. Yugoslavia was one of the first countries that introduced the public insight of 30 days in 1949, and then even further developed it until the 90s. So there was basically a significant deterioration of the planning culture after 2000, and the practice ceased to develop in accordance with the democratic, participatory, and emancipatory models. So the law on planning and construction that was introduced in 2014, after many years of criticism, that it was reduced to the mere public consultation on already prepared decisions, enable citizens' participation in 2 phases. So it's at the beginning and at the end of the plan. The principle of public participation is defined by the current legal framework, as we said, but also Serbia signed like numerous of international agendas and conventions and documents that put this very principle into the focus of urban development and not respecting it. So despite this, the question of participation is reduced to established procedures and the legal minimum that provides only consultations with the general and professional public in the phases of early public insight, that's at the beginning of the plan, the phase lasts 15 days, and at the public insight, which is at the end of the plan, and the phase lasts 30 days. In the final phase of drafting the plan, citizens can also publicly present their objections to the Planning Commission, in front of the Planning Commission. And however, the current practices shows an increased dissatisfaction of citizens that escalates into various forms of protests, fights, and conflicts with decision-making. The recent cases were the public discussion on Mirjevo plan and also general plan of Novi Sad, which really escalated almost into like real violence. So we conducted a public poll opinion in mid-2021 that was based on the focus groups and survey, including a representative sample of Belgrade citizens, and it showed that almost 63% of people do not perceive themselves as involved in urban planning. More than half of the respondents believe that the city is developing in accordance with the private interest of political and economic elite, so every second citizens. And furthermore, every other resident of Belgrade believes that citizens are generally poorly informed about the planned development of the city, urban plans, and projects for Belgrade. So these data show that the level of participation is still very low, that the public informing is not systematic, but also the citizens believe that they have no right to influence their environment or quality of life. Another research that we done in beginning of 2022 was the monitoring report on the level of participation in urban and spatial planning, but like quantitative research on the territory of Belgrade. We did the analysis of 109 plans that took place in Belgrade in 2021 and went through some of the phases in the planning procedure. So, for example, the decision to develop the plan, early public insight, public session, or adoption of the plan. And it showed that the participation is still on the super low level, because in the past year it was applied only to 30% of the total capacity provided by the law. So not even the minimum that is provided by the law is respected in the planning, in the participation planning practices. So it was just like reduced to the mere formality without a significant impact on the offered planning solutions. So we can therefore conclude that the current low level of participation is one of the major weaknesses of the planning system, followed by the insufficient information, lack of transparency on the process, decreased power and inadequate capacities of the relevant institutions, and the context in which spatial policy making takes place is also highly politicized and polarized landscape, where the interests of the investor and the big capital are favored, and this can only lead to escalation of conflicts in urban development and a long-term degradation of the urban space. And that's why we think it's really necessary to think and develop mechanisms that will include and confront the interests of all social actors and make a step forward.
So in this context that was explained now, actually look to the context of, or the concept, I'm sorry, of collaborative planning. So while in the second half of the 20th century there was a shift parallel to the deliberative turn in political theory, there has also been a so-called communicative turn in planning, in urban planning. So from an expert approach to more intensive and widespread citizens' participation. So by changing the planning paradigm from the rational to the communicative collaborative planning, communicative planning theory, sharing common insights, of course, with deliberative democratic theory, which this is why we think it's exciting to share also from our perspective the practices that are also relevant for the wider democratic innovations or attempts. So this theory produced a diverse set of collaborative planning approaches that draw from the assumption that the knowledge of the so-called common people represents just as a relevant insight to the planning as the expertise of the planner, privileged in the rational approach. This is something that we as a collective very strongly stand for. So in addition to that, and in accordance with the transformative assumption of the deliberative theory, the process of building a wider consensus through collaborative planning also changes the participants, as they can produce new relationships, new practices, and new ideas. So aside from this change that changes the role of the planner, this is also, this transformative aspect is something that we were looking at as an inspiration. So the transformation, however, is not reflected in a mere change of the preferences and attitudes, but the process also constitutes these new political subjects. And drawing from the characteristic or the principles of deliberative democracy outlined by Irena Pickett, our most favorite consultant and friend. So in her book Deliberative Citizenship, she outlines the characteristic principles of deliberative democracy, and then we try to transpose them in a way to the case of collaborative planning. in order to argue for this approach within the discipline of urban planning and to and evaluate in particular its empirical experimentation in the context of Serbia that we are in the middle of. So these are the three principles that, as I said, transposed to the planning. Deliberative planning is a highly inclusive process, so starting with the assumption that the access to the process of deliberation needs to be allowed for all the actors affected by the plan in question. So this inclusiveness within the deliberative democracy theory does not insist on all affected actors to be in face-to-face interaction, but rather for all affected interests and existing opinions to be included in the deliberation. So in a way there is a part of representation, yeah, and you will see why this was important when we get to the practice of these forums. The second thing, deliberative planning is a rational and informative process transforming and educating all actors involved. This relies very much on the poll results that Eva just presented. Communication within these deliberative processes is supposed to be based on rational principles, presenting with arguments, which is often in our public procedures very lacking. Then listening to other different positions, again lacking, and having the capacity to understand the reasons behind them and to modify personal attitudes when faced with new insights and arguments. In such a process, assumed personal transformation of all actors involved, and we emphasize this all actors involved because we really want to argue that it is not only the citizens that are being transformed or educated through this process. So when distinguishing a process of traditional participative planning and collaborative planning, Bentrup claims that the former presupposes that the education is necessary only for the public, so only for the citizens, whereas the later, which is collaborative planning, stands at the position that all actors involved, so including planners and including the decision makers, are actually being educated and transformed. And finally, deliberation results in democratically legitimate and higher quality planning solutions, which was, if you have in mind the context of the planning and the plans, the results of such a closed and untransparent planning adoption procedures, then we really think that pushing for the collaborative planning really will bring more quality, higher quality plans and more legitimate plans. And so just one more thing before we go to the practice that we've been through. The process of communicative action assumes reaching a common consensus, even though we feel that such consensus cannot always be reached, especially in the cases of polarized spatial interests. In contemporary cities, the decisions made through collaborative planning, at least concerning some parts of the planning solutions, which we will also demonstrate, are brought through a rational argument-led discussion and therefore have a greater legitimacy. So, yeah, we go to the
So we are diving into these three forums that were organized between November 2021 and April 2022. And we have drawn methodologically, as I said, from deliberative mini-publics that were organized by this institute. These forums, we need to mention that still in the experimental phase, and our aim is to vary the methodological elements from one case to another. So recruitment of the participants, locations of the forum structure, so there are many different things and elements that are really, it's important to understand how each of these elements affects the process itself, and as well as the end of the results. So we will go through these elements in detail. So the first one is...
But quickly. But quickly.
Yes, quickly, no worries. So, yeah, just titles, huh? Okay. Okay, the first one is the identification of the subject, the scope of the plan, and its status in the process of the adoption. So we had one forum before the early public insight, one between the two insights, and one during the public insight before the planning commission. And we did it with 3 different plans. So one was a very detailed plan, one was the general plan of the regulation, and another was the general plan of Belgrade, which is more strategically, ergo super abstract plan. And we actually, what was very understandable from these 3 types of plan is that the more efficient process was on the smaller, as the territory was smaller. So on the abstract level, it's very difficult for randomly selected representative sample to kind of articulate and their alternative proposals on the environment. Next one is providing relevant and accessible information as the preparatory step. So each forum was conditioned with the creation and timely distribution of the printed and online materials for all the participants, which was divided in several sections or elements, like the short introduction, basic information about the plan, summary content of all the different solutions and documents that are important for the info material, external perspectives, and proposed discussion topics for the particular forum, as well as the agenda. The material was prepared by our collective and then shared with the experts just to check if everything is fine over there. The third one is recruitment of the participants. So they were mapped depending on the topic, the participants. Of course, also the territory of the urban plan. For the first and third, we were working with the active local communities on the areas. One was Novi Beograd, another one was Pazinska Skela. But for the general plan of Belgrade, we actually invited the public pooling and agency to help us with the recruitation, so we would have the representative sample of the citizens. In addition to the citizens, we also tried to, we brought the experts in different forums. They were presented from the beginning to the end of the forum, sometimes just on the plenary sessions, sorry. And we also tried to, in the compliance with the collaborative planning process, to involve decision makers and investors. We didn't have luck with that. We can elaborate more later. So they were not involved in or not present in all of these 3 forums. Fourth thing is the structure of the forum. So it really depends on the scope of the plan and the number of participants and anticipated topics, how you actually arrange the whole agenda. It always starts with analyzing the problem, then exploration of participants' attitudes, proposing solutions, discussing and sharing the proposed solutions. And they start working with in the smaller groups, then returning to the plenary sessions, and it really depends how this switch of the sessions is happening, taking into account the importance of the plan and the dynamic of the group. Joanna, okay. Super fast.
No, I will skip the rest of the elements just because for us it's more valuable to go to the concluding remarks, and maybe if you want we can go back to either of the elements in the discussion part. So the experience of the 3 forums has confirmed their potential for the institutionalized democratization of urban planning by actually applying the collaborative approach. Forums have managed to include a much more diverse set of perspectives and actors than it's usually the case with the formal participation opportunities. Even though the representatives from institutions, and as Eva mentioned, decision makers refuse to participate, the deliberation process has fulfilled the criteria of educational and rational discussion among different perspectives, leading towards the consensual list of particular spatial proposals. So it did end with with a very concrete output, leading to, interpreted as the interest of the entire community on the territory of the plan. We have witnessed the transformation among the majority of participants, including both citizens and experts. This is also very important for us. Not only at the level of knowledge and articulation of personal preferences, and attitudes, but also in the motivation to take a more active role in the processes that shape their immediate environment. So it also has a long-term effect on the motivation to take more active part in the political life. So what is yet to be developed and implemented is a more systemic and methodologically consistent way to measure the effects. This is something that in the previous three forums we did not do, in order to build a more solid case for their institutionalization. Furthermore, there are still multiple possible elements to be developed and tested. Firstly, we will aim at including the decision makers and representatives of relevant institutions, as well as the investors. When it comes to the plans, the investors do carry like the perspective or the interest that is relevant for the plan. This could further challenge the process of reaching consensus than it was the case in this through, and the power relations during the process, especially evident in contemporary urban development. Addressing this challenge, but also some of the existing asymmetries in the discussion format mentioned before, the part that we skipped, we aim to work further on the moderation techniques and tools to not only improve the inclusiveness and the equality of the deliberation process, but to also contribute to the increase of its efficiency in bringing relevant outcomes for the planning process. And just to end, finally, the main challenge remains in the informal character of the entire endeavor. Having no institutional support, development of this collaborative planning model requires substantial resources in order to be sufficiently tested and measured. Furthermore, there is a specific tension in the fact that we are pursuing a model that aims to radically change the existing approach to urban planning, while at the same time plugging its results into the existing formal participatory procedures, early public and public insight. However conflicting and challenging this could be, what this practice can achieve in the existing model is multifold. It can raise awareness upon the alternative, more legitimate and democratic approaches to planning, contribute to political subjectivation of citizens and their motivation to take more active participation in political decisions, including planning, and sensitize experts and hopefully councillors or the representatives of public institutions, to sensitize them in order to build an infrastructure, wider infrastructure for potential future transformation in the planning practice. Sorry, this was...
Thank you very much for your presentation. Now for the final session, for the final presentation for this session, we are zooming out from the specific cases and going to, you have a presentation, yeah?
Yes, just if I can get the pointer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just to say, those who are waiting to go for a tour, we are going with the tour, and we are definitely starting later, so let's say 3:30 would be the departing point.
I'll try to be fairly short and bring out some main points, because this is fairly theoretical in nature with some view to applying this sort of participatory model that I want to emphasize, and just bring about some characteristics that I think can help with challenges that participation faces and which we heard about previous 2 days and just in the previous talk as well. So going back as yesterday to the depressing VDM report, you can see that the level of democratization globally has dropped sharply in the past 30 years. And here are some, again, fairly depressing numbers. So 70% of the world population lives in autocracies currently, compared to 49% just 10 years ago. A number of countries that threaten freedom of expression is now 35, where it was just 5 10 years ago. And autocratizing countries, which is especially worrisome, which are countries sliding toward becoming full-blown autocracies, is also increased from 5% to 36%. And in the optimistic words of Lindbergh, the last 30 years of democratic advances are now eradicated. So that's the framework for the need for participation. Now, what is interesting is the 6 components that we then outlines when determining whether a country is democratic or autocratic. You can see above three: rule of law, judicial constraints, and legislative constraints. And at the bottom, clean elections, freedom of association, and freedom of expression. Now, they don't do it, but I think we can group these factors into the first three, which have more to do with how branches of government work, which are the rule of law, judicial constraints, and legislative constraints, and the separation of power, which is something that is distinctive for democracy and not at all common in autocracies. And the following three: clean elections, freedom of association, and freedom of expression, which I think point to some participative elements. Because clean elections are, of course, participative in nature, but more than that, both freedom of association and freedom of expression speak very clearly to tendencies of people and their freedom to participate, and, which is something that I will emphasize a little later, be recognized in that participation. So the two questions that will be guiding me are: how can participation be made genuinely effective, and how to account for different forms of participation. Or in other words, what I wanted to try and accomplish are really two things. So on the one hand, there are different challenges to participative models, whether they can be effective, or whether they can be instituted at all, and political realists like to deny that very fervently. And on the other hand, can we use participative models to recognize existing problems in countries on the democracy-autocracy spectrum? So whichever country we choose, can we, let's say, develop a diagnostic feature of such a model? And the challenges of participation, I will skip this. Let's start with the basic division, which I think we can draw: constructive participation and reactive participation. So what we've been talking about mostly here, and what these events that have been organized embody, is constructive participation. So this is the space in which people come together, discuss different things, try to determine how some public policy or some public measure can take place, be enacted, what are its problems. Reactive participation is much more violent in nature. Strikes and protests are, as we know, here in Serbia, very common. And you can also add to this list union fights, for instance. So this is what happens when people become interested, based not on some interest in public policy, but based on some sense of being in jeopardy on any particular front. And in literature, you will find, in theoretical literature especially, you will find that problems of participation boil down to these four: complexity, capacity, manipulation, and coercion. So the first two are, I think, very predictable in the sense that it is difficult to organize an effective participative event, as many of you have had an experience, talked about, simply because the issues have become more increasingly complex, require expertise, require knowledge of different nuanced issues, require following various aspects of societal, economic, political, cultural aspects of a social life in general. And just take as an example a simple question with a complex answer: do you want a nuclear plant in Obrenovac, for instance? So to answer this, we need to know nuances of energy policy, data regarding nuclear energy versus coal, oil, electricity, etc. We have to take into account different local, communal aspects of financing a nuclear plant. All of that has to be known, ideally, by all the people who participate in such an event. And there are, again, criticisms that this simply cannot be achieved, so leave it to the experts and leave it to the elected officials. And capacity is closely tied to that, and sometimes motivation is thrown into it, because when people see that issues are complicated, they'll be less motivated to consistently participate. The second two are maybe even more interesting. Manipulation occurs when you have participative events, but they're manipulated in a way that renders them ineffective by the government itself. And we have seen, for instance, cases like this when you make people participate in online polls regarding, let's say, color of public transportation, and make them contribute to something very important, like I will decide what I see every day in front of me when I take a bus. But on the other hand, leave them, let's say, fatigued for any kind of meaningful participative event. And coercion goes, Zakaras, for instance, talked about this. When you have more pernicious, and this is common for autocracies much more than for democracies, when you have coercive events in which you can publicly say that people are participating, but outcomes are more or less predetermined. And I think sort of a guiding question that leads political realists to skeptical conclusions, which we do not have to accept, but questions are meaningful all the same, is how can this go wrong? How can an interesting or useful or potentially fruitful democratic innovation go wrong in the hand of a government which doesn't mean well? And this is something that ideally a participative model should guard against. And here are some conditions about effective participation. So methods of participation need to be well defined. The substance of participation needs to contain both democratic competence and relevant expertise. So democratic competence so that you don't face manipulation or coercion. And third, the government needs to be receptive to the outcomes of such participation. This is where responsiveness comes into place. Where participation that is just one-sided, and this is what Ministry of Space talked about, and we have witnessed in numerous events, when you do tend to make a sort of contribution that is ideally required of a citizen, when you take the time to introduce yourself to different nuanced policy questions, and then you are just not listened to because no one has to listen to you. So participation without responsiveness is not really something that can ensure democratic vitality. So in a sense, in that diagnostic sense that I mentioned, you can track and see if a country has participative elements but not responsive elements, and see and determine that this is not very democratically vital, even prima facie it would seem to be. This is a quote from Edison, I will skip it too. It has to do with the epistemic checks and balances part of the title, which I will get to. The point is, with participation and responsiveness, if you have them, you can develop the third element, which is interaction, which means making genuine partnership between citizens and their elected government. And this means that you will not, we have heard something about this yesterday, influence policy every 4 years on one day, which tends, as we have seen and many of you have mentioned, make people lose interest in participating in that way, but make people feel like they are being asked to contribute consistently and that they are being heard of. And one thing that was of interest to me in that sense is the Belgian example, where this sort of co-decisiveness or cooperation is most favored by the councillors. And I suppose that something of that has to do with the capacity of people to contribute because they're already very involved in public life. Because as far as I remember, Belgium always has very high turnouts for the elections, somewhere about 90%. And they also have mandatory elections, which is an interesting concept, not agreed in theory by all, but can lead to some positive effects here in concern to democratic vitality. So if you have that sort of an ideal, participation, responsiveness, interaction, the question is, well, how do you achieve this? Or how do you begin to achieve this? And one thing I think is important is to have this sort of notion of epistemic checks and balances, which means we know roughly the same amount of information. We don't have to know as much as experts on energy policy, but we have to know enough to recognize if we are being manipulated. And epistemic lopsidedness, as I mentioned, meaning one side knows much more than the other, doesn't really lead necessarily to better decisions epistemically. It leads to perhaps sort of emphasizing fallibility if there are such tendencies. So government and its experts do not feel the pressure from the public to explain more, to include them more, because they don't feel this sort of epistemic pressure from the people who know. But if the public turns out to know enough, and it doesn't have to know too much, then that will institute a sort of interaction that can be brought roughly to the same level. And this is also important because of the threat of populism, and you will see that I go to that side a lot because of this sort of autocratization that doesn't threaten just this region, but again is global. And populism, populist governments generally are very good at misusing good democratic practices. That is why you have to always wonder, how can this go wrong? Because you don't want for a path to autocracy be paved with good democratic innovations. You want to protect them somehow. And what is common for autocratic governments to do is to accept a democratic innovation, like say a participatory forum or public insights, as you mentioned. So you have this sort of public debates. It was talked about by Stefani, I think. So you have obligatory public debates, and you have them here. But then you listen to the experts who always say, well, we talk, but no one listens. So we have some sort of debate, and the decision is all the same. So that, again, I think can track the sort of state of democracy, whether it is vital, not vital, whether it is robust or weak, to what degree it is important to guard it from sliding toward autocracy. And let's say the discussion of government responsiveness in connection with democratic vitality must be brought to the normative level. So this is where we go a bit more abstract in comparison to some of the empirical studies, just to make some sort of framework which can help us decide on research questions, research avenues we can further employ in the future. And just the citizen participation reflects the interests of the public for decision making and policy making. So government responsiveness needs to track the participative performance of the citizens. So the more you are willing to participate, the government should be ready to respond. And if not, then what happens, I think by way of some sort of not at all or very probable predictions, is that you will, or government will have reactive participation on its hand. And here the responsiveness interaction we talked about. So the genuine democratic interaction can help us resolve the objections to participative model if it is instituted properly. You know how to avoid manipulation and coercion. Simply put, the government who tries it will be punished at the following elections, if not sooner. So the public, which is in that sort of sense trained for participation and trained to recognize when it is being epistemically or in other ways politically manipulated, will not hold that power or that government in power too long. And one case which I can cover just in 2 minutes, this is just a sort of an illustration. It is not a case study. It is simply something that happened in the United States recently. The pipeline that was instituted in order to supposedly ensure energy independence, global energy independence of the United States. There are different studies on whether that would be possible. But the point was that it was supposed to traverse the entire United States and bring about a very, very detrimental environmental effect, because it extracted tar oils, which are even more toxic than, say, coal or even, or rather any other form of energy supply. And after more than 10 years of tenacious protests, drawn-out legal battles, and flip-flopping of executive orders spanning 3 presidential administrations, the Keystone XL pipeline is now gone for good. I mentioned that to say that at the surface level, you could say that this was a good instance of vital democracy. A public policy was proposed, people protested, it was covered in media very intensively, and now the project was scrapped. However, one problem is that the sides were already divided ideologically. So when one side came into power, it tried to push through the project regardless of the protests. When the other side came into power in 2020, it scrapped the project. And you can see that the opinion polls, which is now a good indicator, shifted within 4 years. So in 2013, 66% of the US citizens supported the project. And just a few years later, 48% of citizens opposed the project, in contrast to 23% 4 years earlier. So protests did manage something, managed to inform the public, managed to raise the interests, managed to motivate the other side, at least politically, to react. But the point of this model is that it shouldn't have come to that. Before this reactive participation, constructive participation could have taken place, and people could have been interested and informed in a much less violent and potentially dangerous and politically polarizing way. So that is it, just briefly, and thank you.
Thank you. It was really interesting presentation. Thank you very much. Now I'm opening the floor for the questions. We have around 20 minutes for discussion, so please, let's see for this interesting 5 presentations. Sorry, yeah.
I would have 2 questions. One is inspired by the last presentation, but also the other panelists are welcome to reflect on that. How do you, I mean, with local participatory mechanisms, 2 questions. How do you deal with checks and balances? I mean, you mentioned checks and balances not just between institutions and local participatory democracy, but also these votes should be subject to checks and balances. How do you deal with that? Because, I mean, the famous example is the Swiss local referenda on naturalization, where, like, you know, the Ich's last name or the Turkish last names don't get naturalized, and the ones who have German last names get naturalized. And of course, from a human rights perspective, it's very troubling that citizens vote on who should be naturalized, but that's where checks and balances are missing in a certain way on local democracy level. So the question is how to deal with that. And the second one is, of course, the question of what, you know, what we call NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard attitudes, right? So nobody wants to have a trash dump in their backyard, but somebody has to build a trash dump somewhere, right? And a lot of, we see often local initiatives for local referenda in many countries, which lead to the rejection of projects like railway lines, you know, trash dumps and so on, which are all needed from a larger societal question, but nobody wants to have it in their backyard. Everybody wants to have, of course, trash, which can be dumped somewhere. But so how does one deal with that challenge of local democracy? Because people, of course, are going to vote against that, because who wants to do it? But, like, still need those infrastructures. So how do you deal with that particular challenge? I would be really interested to hear from those who talked about the kind of current experiences. And for the historical 2 papers, which are really fascinating, I would be kind of interesting to hear what is, you know, did these structures just fail because Yugoslavia failed? You know, like about their decline. Like, you know, was the decline something which happened before the end of Yugoslavia, that they kind of were in crisis already in the 80s, or was it just that the system rupture just kind of led to their collapse? Just kind of understand the trajectory of their decline within, especially the Serbian context. Thanks.
If there is any more, in a moment, yeah, just collect you.
Yeah, very interesting presentations. I have a quick question for the historical presentations about the level of autonomy of these instances. Because I have studied the case of Cuba, for instance, which is currently promoting this kind of participatory institutions at the local level, but they are highly controlled. So you have a structure that in paper sounds very good, but in practice is super hierarchic and there is no autonomy at all.
There is one more, yeah, in the back.
Yes, I have a question for Nina. So I'm not familiar with the method that you used, so maybe that's the reason why I didn't pick it. I'm not sure it was clear to me for the legitimacy of the decision, the output, if it was a merge, a synthetic indicator that you use from the different variables, or is it, because sometimes you could have indicators that go in different directions. So I would like to see this clarified. And the second question is, if I got it right, I think you mentioned that the Burgmeister are not included in your analysis. And do you expect that the results from the executive branch will be different from legislative branch? And yeah.
Thanks a lot. Now.
Okay, so Thank you for the questions. So the question of checks and balances is an interesting one because, of course, when you leave it to decision-making of any particular civic entity, you can have some sort of errors in questions. So when you ask people, people can, of course, decide against something, for something that is against their own interests. But I think that is where this deliberative component can come into place. So you can have deliberative events which do manage to inform people, and that has been done in different settings. So we have heard about Europolis in Belgium. There was research done in countries which have less deliberative experience, more deliberative experience, and everywhere there was a sort of success, even if those events were fairly limited ones, where even different methodological approaches yielded good benefits. For instance, Fishkin's deliberative polling has been shown to change preferences of participants in light of provided materials between the two deliberative events very reliably. And also qualitative method, which tracks discourse quality through an index. This is developed by Steiner and some other people, which tries to show that even without moderation, so without a qualified moderator, people just in a room having no prior experience at all can become interested and in same questions, even if they were previously divided. So this is something that was especially interesting. There is a study, Deliberation Across Deep Divisions, I think the 2019 book, which details a large number of events which had positive impact on people's interest and people's level of knowledge in their local and country level topics. So I think that is the way to go before you start the interaction between citizens and the governments. But it is also a necessary step because that is the road to this sort of epistemic pressure against the governments, who will know that they cannot manipulate or coerce people who are that informed and that interested. So in that sense, we have a good working model, I think, that we can try to apply in different settings and try to make try to strengthen its external validity more. And I think I would go to a similar answer for local communities and for local community issues. So not to take too much time. So thank you.
I will quickly address the issue of checks and balances. And I'm not sure that your example is example of lack of check and balances in local participation. I think it's more of an example of the bad sides of the referendum as a form of participatory democracy. And the referendum is highly controversial form, and I think we all know it, because Switzerland actually does have some sorts of checks and balances. So if you need to have a local referendum, you have to have referendum in all surrounding local communities. You have to have a cantonal referendum and then national. And in this case, obviously, the Swiss people just think that they want only certain types of people to be naturalized. So I'm not sure that that's a problem of lack of checks and balances. It also leads to question, this is a general question and a completely different topic. Could you decide on such things? Should you decide on such things of referenda? And it is very important now, for example, when we're speaking about marriage equality and the similar stuff. So I'm not sure that the issue is local, lack of local level checks and balances. And I do not really have an answer to that and how should it be. Regarding the decline of self-government, I'm very curious to hear Mladen's opinion. Economically, the system was working and it was performing, as far as I know, excellently by the beginning of the 80s. So even in terms of GDP growth and so on, it was working pretty well. And then in the 80s, as Martin said, there was economic crisis, and I think it very much contributed to the not necessarily decline of the system, but decline of trust in the system on the side of the people. And so in 1988, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the crumbling of the Eastern Bloc, I think that was one of the reasons why it was just quickly abandoned and, like buried and forgotten in all of its aspects. To try to answer your question, Mladen also mentioned when you look at the literature, and there is a lot of literature on Messenzajednice, It's either normative about what mezzanine should do, or it is mezzanine boosting about what they have done. So it's really hard to, without some serious ethnographic research, which I'm not sure if it is possible now, like 40 or 50 years after the fact, to see to which extent they work. I believe that in some aspects, which are not very political maybe, they actually worked. In, I don't know, places of socialization, as some sort of youth centers, and they had some functions that they did fulfill. And it is perhaps very possible that the ruling party actually used these aspects to, you know, like provide some areas of freedom in order to divert people from organizing politically. Maybe, this is just my hypothesis, and I'm not sure if it answers your question.
Okay. Is this on? Yeah.
Okay. Well, it was.
It was. Okay, I'm struggling a bit with it. How do you deal with checks and balances? Where I think the Yugoslav socialist or self-managed system had a serious system of checks and balances, because the local communities were just one piece of the puzzle of self-management at the local level. As I said, there were a lot of different self-managed communities and organizations. I mentioned that the communal assembly was divided in 3 chambers, one being the chamber of local communities, but there was also a chamber of associated labor, which was hosted delegates that were voted in the enterprises by workers, and a chamber of social political organizations. And there was also another institution called the Self-Managed Communities of Interest, which dealt with the distribution of public funding for social services, such as education or health or social assistance and so on, within which the users and the providers of services agreed on how this funding was going to be distributed. So to sum it up, what was put in place was what they called a system of integral self-management, which involved a lot of different actors, out of which the local communities were just one. The commune was never meant to be just an association of local communities. No. How do you deal with not in my backyard attitudes? This is a good question, because I think it was an issue at the time. As one local community secretary told me, the biggest thing that local communities did was what they prevented to do in their areas. And you have lots of examples where people mobilized against the building of car parks or other buildings in their areas and were successful at it. And I had complaints from a former executive council, city executive council representative, who said that we just had to impose, for example, there's a car park just on the other side of the road here, below the Belgrađanka, the tall building, which was built in the 80s, and there was a massive mobilization of the local community against this, but at the end they had to impose it because there were not many other options. Why did the local communities collapse? I'm not going to talk about self-management in general, but the local communities, they still formally exist in Serbia nowadays, but they have lost their meaning in the sense that they are no longer a tool of citizen participation or self-organization. They are just an extension of local government. And this is the result of the change of the constitution in 1990, where self-management was just suspended and the electoral representative democracy was introduced, where basically the link between the communal assembly and the local communities was abolished. So the communal assembly is now just hosts representatives that are elected through elections. There are no more representatives of local communities, and hence they lost all their influence. And finally, the level of autonomy. Yeah, that's a really good and tricky question. As I mentioned, the delegates in local communities were screened by the Socialist Alliance of Working People, which included the League of Communists, but not only. It was a much wider organization. So there was a level of control there. To what extent they could effectively control local communities, even in small areas, in villages, that's very debatable. This requires additional research, I'm afraid.
Thank you. And now, Nina.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to first answer the questions of Florian. I think maybe the possible solution to these checks and balances problems, and actually also to the NIMBY problems, is using like mixed method participatory arrangements. Like you can use a referendum supplemented to deliberative democracy, and maybe this can actually make people think more. Okay, but my neighbor and me, we're not willing to have this like stuff in our neighborhood, but the one in the neighborhood next to me maybe already also needs it, and we all need it, and everybody doesn't want it. But maybe by using this like mix, you can salute these problems with NIMBY and checks and balances. But I'm not really sure because I only did this. Regarding to the questions about the legitimacy perceptions in the output legitimacy, so we measured the extent to which councillors thought that it was like a way of giving a solution that will work. So that is about the effectiveness of the solution. While we also stated that the solution can be like cost effectively or cost not effectively, but not only cost but resources in a greater sense. Like it can be personnel who has to be used for implementing the output actually of the decision. Like when you have that school building, there can be a lot of finances needed in order to repurpose it to like a swimming pool, or I don't know. But it's mainly that part of effectiveness and efficiency that we asked our councillors. Regarding to what I think about the executive branch, so as I said, it is in an interdisciplinary project where this survey was also done with majors and aldermen, and they actually had the same overall pattern. Like the co-decisive form is also the most wanted form of participatory arrangements, but they have different groups of actually majors and aldermen regarding to what they think. They actually have less bad sides on the classic representative democracy, because actually they think that this form is more legitimate than, not more legitimate than the rest, but more than compared to the councillors' perceptions actually. But it has to be elaborately analyzed by us to give more information about it, so it will come, but not yet done.
Thanks a lot. Well, thank you very much for being with us and taking part in this session. We are going to have now the Belgrade activist tour, which will be led by Dušanka and Sara, and I don't see any of them. Oh, there are. So just stand up, please, so people can see you. So they will guide you through the, I would say, places of resistance here, to the current neoliberal populist government and the whole logic behind it. So I think it would be really interesting, and they organized also some activists along the route you can speak with. So enjoy the tour, and we see in the morning at 9:30 here. Thank you.